Alberta has long been one of the top destinations for oil and gas investments, but not so much over the last few years. So where do we rank now compared to our American and provincial competitors? We are joined by Ashley Stedman, Senior Policy Analyst with the Fraser Institute and co-author of the Canada-U.S. Energy Sector Competitiveness Survey 2019, which you can see online at fraserinstitute.org. Ashley, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
You bet. Can you first of all tell us, Ashley, how you went about gathering these numbers and comparisons for the survey? Who did you talk to? Which states did you compare our provinces to? That sort of thing?
Yeah, so once again this year we surveyed oil and gas investors to find out which policies detract or deter investment. And we like to see this survey as a report card on government policy. And what we found this year is that U.S. jurisdictions dominate the list of top performers, while Canadian jurisdictions are really falling behind, and they're seen as unattractive in the eyes of investors.
Yeah, that's not a good place to be. So where did Alberta rank this year? And did any of our provinces actually make it into the top 10 for North America?
Yeah, so we ranked 5 Canadian provinces and 15 US states in our survey this year, and Alberta ranks 16th out of 20 jurisdictions, so that would be in the bottom half of jurisdictions overall in the survey. And really what we're seeing here is that investors are raising a red flag in terms of Canada having unattractive policies, and none of the Canadian jurisdictions made the list of top performers.
Yeah, that is a disappointment, big time. Now, which U.S. states did manage to crack the top 10 this year? Was Texas near the top again?
Yeah, so Texas is the top performer in this year's survey. The second jurisdiction is Oklahoma, third is Kansas, and then we see a number of other U.S. jurisdictions rounding out that list of the top 10, including competitors like North Dakota, whereas we see Canadian jurisdictions falling behind. The top performing Canadian jurisdiction is Saskatchewan this year, and it ranks 13th, which is far behind the top 10 performers.
Mm-hmm. So what did oil executives list as the barriers to investment in Alberta? Now, does this tie in with the uncertainty concerning environmental regulations, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so this year the top areas of concern for Alberta listed by investors were uncertainty concerning environmental regulations. We saw 80% of respondents were deterred by this factor in Alberta compared to only 9% for Texas. The second area was regulatory duplication and inconsistencies. We see that 65% of respondents were deterred by this factor in Alberta compared to only 8% for Texas. And then the third area of concern was the high cost of regulatory compliance in this province. So 65% of respondents were deterred by that factor, whereas only 10% were deterred in Texas.
Okay, I know our premier just made a trip to Texas to try to spur investment here, and that's one of the things he brought up was the red tape regulation issues, high taxes, that sort of thing. So obviously they are aware of this, so they're going to try to reduce that. And would you say from this particular study here that if in fact we were able to cut those red tape regulatory issues, that would spur in fact more oil and gas investment in our province?
Yeah, so really what we're seeing is that onerous and uncertain regulations are really taking their toll on Canada's energy sector. And what we want to see is policymakers in Ottawa and in Edmonton working towards streamlining regulations and adopting competitive policies to make our energy sector attractive for investment once again.
Yeah, it needs to happen. Now, labor regulations and employment agreements also came up as a concern to potential investors. Can you give us any examples of what specifically causes concern in that area?
Yeah, so this is a broad category that we ask investors about. So we cannot point to specific policies in that area, but broadly it looks at the impact of labor regulations, the impact of employment agreements, and local hiring requirements, things like that. So we do see this as a concern, but it wasn't the top concern listed by investors this year.
Right. And one of the other concerns, speaking of, hiring people, is again the available workforce, the quality of that workforce. Are we doing okay in that area?
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't one of the major areas where we saw significant concern. The major areas of concern are really uncertainty surrounding environmental regulations and regulatory duplication and inconsistencies. We're seeing a lot of overlap between provincial and federal regulations, and that seems to be what the problem is for investors and why they're moving their investment opportunities and their capital elsewhere.
Right. And high taxes was also, of course, another factor here as well, right? And so how did we compare, I guess, with taxes in Alberta specifically compared to some of the top jurisdictions south of the border?
Yeah, so when we look at taxation in general and how investors perceive taxation in Alberta, what we see as 53% of respondents were deterred by taxation in Alberta, compared to only 12% in Texas. So again, there's considerable room for improvement in the eyes of investors on this factor as well.
Well, I mean, that's like a four times factor here. I mean, wow. So obviously taxes, something has to be done there to bring that into alignment here with our competitors. Otherwise, we'll continue to lose business south of the border. A couple of policy areas that hamper investor perceptions of Canadian jurisdictions. Uncertainty concerning disputed land claims and also uncertainty over which areas will be protected. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah, so actually, we see disputed land claims and protected areas as a concern of mining investors and petroleum investors. And really, it's just around uncertainty in these areas, around what areas will be protected as parks or disputed land claims, those kind of issues. So we see that as an issue across the board between mining and petroleum investors in this country, and really in Alberta and British Columbia in particular.
Now, do they face the similar problems south of the border on those two issues? Or is it, again, a huge gap between north and south here?
We do see significant concern over these factors in jurisdictions like Alberta and BC over other competing jurisdictions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would probably behoove us to take a look at what they are doing and saying, hey, maybe they're doing something that works that we aren't doing, and we can learn from it. It is interesting that Saskatchewan and Newfoundland outdid Alberta. I think you mentioned Saskatchewan was on top as far as our provincial jurisdictions here for oil and gas investment. So what are they doing better than we are in Saskatchewan and Newfoundland?
Yeah, so when we look at factors like uncertainty concerning environmental regulations, and actually in particular regulatory duplication and inconsistencies, these are areas where these provinces, that is Saskatchewan and Newfoundland, tend to perform better than Alberta. So it seems like there's less overlap in regulations in these provinces compared to Alberta.
Okay. For the third straight year, British Columbia is Canada's least attractive jurisdiction for oil and gas investment. Maybe the most beautiful province in Canada. But man, something's going on with the oil and gas business there. So what is it specifically that investors don't like about BC?
Yeah, so this year British Columbia was the worst performing jurisdiction in Canada, and it ranked 19th out of 20th, so it's the second worst overall in the survey. And this year, investors pointed to uncertainty concerning environmental regulations, taxation, and concerns over political stabilities as the major areas of concern in that province.
Interesting. So the whole minority government situation perhaps doesn't help oil and gas investment because they're not sure which way it's going to go?
Yeah, I mean, we did see that 87% of respondents were deterred by political stability in that province, and that's ultimately a major area of concern for investors this year.
87%. Okay, that is high for the political side of things. Now, Alberta, how did we do, I guess, in Alberta, and then compare that to how much political instability factored in Texas, for example?
Yeah, so I mean, we do see that political stability is not as much of a concern in Alberta as it was in one of the top three areas of concern listed by investors. We do see that American jurisdictions perform better across the board on a number of areas, and ultimately it shows that there's considerable room for improvement here in Canada.
Yeah, the jurisdictions of Texas and Oklahoma consistently rank in the top 10 over the years, and so they are doing some things differently. Is there anything that jumps out at you from your survey here that we should, again, hey, pay attention to, saying, all right, let's do what they're doing here to attract more investment?
Yeah, so we just see that investors are really pointing to stability in terms of the regulatory environment south of the border. And in jurisdictions like Texas, we see that only 9% are deterred by uncertainty concerning environmental regulations compared to 80% here in Alberta. So really, this is an area where we see that there's a lot more stability in terms of the regulatory environment south of the border, and investors are paying attention to that.
Yeah. All right. Can you share some of the actual comments that oil executives made about Canada, just to give our viewers an idea of what comes to mind when investors think about investing here?
Yeah, so we see pipeline concerns as one of the major factors that is cited by investors in the comment section. So we know that insufficient pipeline capacity is deterring investors, and that is reflected in the comment section. And investors really said that Canada is a high risk place to invest right now, given the uncertain and subjective regulatory environment that we're seeing here. So those are some of the comments that we see, and ultimately, it's not good news for Canada.
Pipelines. Okay. Heard that before. Now, on the flip side, can you share a few of the comments investors made about American states? And again, well, I guess the comments are going to be something a little more along the positive lines, right?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of Texas, we saw some comments about approval processes being timely. And that's again speaking to the fact that the regulatory environment is much more certain there in terms of issuing permits. And that is something that we need to focus on here in Canada, of getting our regulatory environment to be competitive with our neighbors south of the border.
Okay. Can you kind of recap here? What does Alberta, what does Canada need to change then to attract oil and gas investment?
Yeah, so if policymakers are serious about restoring investment attractiveness in Canada's energy sector, they're going to focus on streamlining regulations and ultimately adopting competitive policies to ensure that this country is attractive in the eyes of oil and gas investors once again.
Yeah, it boils down to something pretty simple, doesn't it, right? I mean, lower taxes, better regulations and so forth. Got to get some certainty, a stable business environment. So the question is, I guess, will these changes be made? And if so, how long will it take to make these changes to actually get them in place? I don't know if your survey addressed that. I mean, how long it would take to get these things in place here in Canada?
Yeah, so we don't ask a question in regards to timelines, but we do know that it takes time for investor perceptions to change. So when those policy changes happen, it does take time to trickle down to investors so that they're aware of what the policy environment looks like.
Hmm. How long do you think it? I mean, let's say they did actually make these changes in Alberta and Canada, and we know Alberta is making changes as we speak. But if everything came together and gelled, and we made some really good positives, how long would it take for investors to respond to that? I mean, I guess in my mind, I think this through. Okay, political instability was one of the factors here as well. Would they hesitate for a significant time, just out of concern that the next government elected, be it provincially or federally, would simply change regulations and taxes back to where they were before, again creating an uncertain investment environment?
Yeah, so really we have to let future surveys tell us that we want to see those changes made, in Ottawa and in Edmonton, and then we will look to future survey publications to tell us, when that trickles down to investors and how investors perceive Canada at that time.
Yeah, perception does matter in this business, doesn't it? Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Ashley.
Thanks so much for having me on.
You bet. Ashley Stedman, she's the co-author of the Canada-U.S. Energy Sector Competitiveness Survey 2019. You can read that in its full detail at fraserinstitute.org.